Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Southeast New England Program Network, welcome to our webinar titled Accelerating the Pace of Wetlands Restoration, brought to you by Mass Audubon. My name is Leah Soloway from the New England Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be managing logistics for today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce and provide you all with a little background about the SNEP Network. The SNEP Network's mission is to empower communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through the management of stormwater and restoration projects. The SNEP Network focuses on building local capacity by providing no-cost trainings, webinars, and technical assistance to communities in the SNEP region. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, snepnetwork.org. And before we begin the webinar, there are a few logistics to keep in mind. First, everyone will be on mute to ensure audio quality. At the end of the webinar, there'll be a Q&A session. You'll be able to ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel. We look forward to answering questions, so please type them in at any time. And I'd like to also remind you that this recording will be available following the webinar. On that note, I'd like to hand things over to Heidi Ritchie, Director of Policy and Advocacy with Mass Audubon. Thanks, Heidi, for being here. And I'll stop sharing my screen, and you can share.
Thanks, Leah. And thank you all for attending. I'm just going to share my screen as well. Just a moment. Okay. Now it skipped all the way to the end. Just a second. All right, here we are. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. As Leah said, the recording and also PDF of the slides will be available after the webinar. They'll be posting it on the SNEP Network website. And so there are a number of resources and links within the presentation, and those will be clickable links in the PDF. So I'll just start by introducing myself. I'm Heidi Ritchie, Director of Policy and Advocacy at Mass Audubon. And I've worked on a lot of things over my career, but there's been a consistent line through on wetlands and water resources protection and regulation. I've worked very hard to make sure that these resources are strongly protected from the impacts of development. But in recent years, I've become more and more interested in restoring the past damage that has occurred to these resources. So that's what we'll be talking about today. I'm also on the board of the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance, which is an alliance of 85 different organizations interested in protecting and restoring rivers. They have a whole series of webinars on dam removal called Dam Busters, and those are free, and the past recordings and PDFs of their presentations are also available. So I encourage you to check that out. That's one of the resources at the end of the slideshow. And then I'm also on the board of the Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissions. So very interested in the work of local officials in advancing protection and restoration of wetlands. Of course, I work for Mass Audubon, which is the largest nature-based conservation organization in New England. We were founded in 1896, so we've been around a long time. I've always worked on advocacy, but also science, and we have a lot of educational programs. We have 160,000 members and supporters. We work, all of our work currently is guided by our action agenda, which has 3 big interconnected goals. The first is to protect and steward lands for the benefit of both people and nature. Secondly, we want to make sure that everyone has access to the benefits of nature. And thirdly, responding to really the biggest threat of our times, climate change, and in particular, the role of nature in responding to that, whether it's sequestering carbon in our forests and wetlands, or providing resilience from the increasingly intense storms and more frequent droughts that we're seeing. As Leah said, this program is sponsored by the SNEP network, which is a program of the EPA. And here's that map showing the geographic region. This network is comprised of many different partners, of which Mass Audubon is one. I encourage you to check out the many resources on their website. Although it is a geographically based program and that some of the direct services are only available within that geographic area, there are a wealth of resources and information and tools available on their website that are broadly applicable across a much wider region, even across states. So I encourage you to check that out. So we're just going to start here with a quick poll just to see who you all are and what sort of categories you fall into. So do a quick poll. Great. So it looks like we have a nice mix of folks here, including federal, state, and local officials, as well as lots of nonprofits and some consultants. We don't have anyone here representing Indigenous communities, but I would just note that the whole, all the work that's going on, certainly that we're doing in restoring and stewarding wetlands and other natural resources, we really take a lot of stock and important knowledge that's available from the tribes and working with them on some of these projects. Great, so let's advance. Okay, so there are three main things that I hope you will take away from the webinar today. First of all, that restoration really can heal past damage to our important wetland and water resources. And that one of the main barriers to advancing this work is the cost and delays associated with permitting, and why we need really a whole new systems approach to this work and some ideas for doing that. Just as a reminder, I'm sure if you're here today in this webinar, you appreciate the value of wetlands. They provide so many important ecosystem services for us. And Mass Audubon has a series of fact sheets on the value of nature, including one on wetlands and waterways and another on coastal resources. So that's something else maybe you might want to check out. So let's start by defining what ecological restoration is. And again, I want to thank you for your interest in this topic. This is Alex Hackman, Mass Audubon's Director of Ecological Restoration, and I just wanted to acknowledge him here. I've also used a number of his slides in this presentation, but Alex is a wealth not only of technical expertise. He's worked on so many different restoration projects. He was with the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration before he came to Mass Audubon. But he's also just so inspiring and approachable, and really, you know, a joy to work with. So thank you, Alex. There is an International Society for Ecological Restoration, and this is their definition of ecological restoration: the process of assisting in the recovery of an ecosystem that has been damaged, degraded, or destroyed. And Massachusetts, Rhode Island, actually throughout New England, there are many of our ecosystems, particularly wetlands and rivers, that have been severely damaged and degraded. Just breaking this down a little bit more, what do we mean by damage, degradation, and destruction? it's really a spectrum of impacts across a continuum. So damage might be sort of acute impacts, like an incipient infestation with an invasive that can be quickly remediated if it's caught in time. Degradation is more extensive, chronic impacts, and that would include things like dams, conversion of wetlands to agricultural use, etc. And some of the other things that's really the main area that I'm going to be focusing on today. Destruction is when something has been completely obliterated, usually by development, such that there's really no visible wetland remaining. Even then, sometimes there can be restoration. I'm familiar with a number of riverfront restoration projects. For example, in Taunton, they tore down an old mill and built a park and planted native plants, and that's been done in other cities across the country. So, destruction is difficult to remediate and expensive, but it's not always forever. And similarly, the work of restoration occurs across a spectrum from very simple things like removing invasive species or planting natives, like restoring a buffer zone that's currently the lawn goes right down to the edge of the water. The SNP network has a guidebook on buffer zone restoration and how to go about that and converting that lawn into a native habitat. Some restoration, though, is much more complicated, particularly when the damage has been much more extensive and you need to restore the hydrology and the topography of the land. So what do we mean by assisting in the recovery? So first, it's really restoring the natural functioning, the processes that allow these systems to function on their own. So if we do a good job restoring the hydrology and the topography and the soils, oftentimes there's even a native seed bank there, perhaps there's some ongoing management that needs to take place, but oftentimes nature is very resilient and you give it a chance and it will restore itself once given that chance. Then there's the reconnection. I'm going to talk about how a lot of the damage that we've done to our water resources has fragmented them, and the connectivity is important. The rivers are really the highways for not only fish and other aquatic life, but also other plants and animals, terrestrial plants and animals, and that's increasingly important with climate change and the need for our wildlife and plants to be able to move across the landscape. And third is the important role of people. These resources will only be restored over the long term if people are aware of them and appreciate them and continue to stay involved. Most of the work that I'm going to talk about is really low risk. And I want to contrast that with the ongoing impacts of not doing this work. So I'm going to talk more about that later, but I wanted to introduce that concept early on. So I'm going to give some examples now about what I'm talking about, because I think sometimes when I talk with the regulators, they're concerned about the amount of what they call impact of a restoration project. But the fact is that that historic damage to the resource is so extensive and it's not going to heal itself on its own, that there's ongoing impacts that the regulatory system does not recognize or require to be addressed. So here's a cranberry bog. This was probably a wetland at some point in time, perhaps might have even been 100 or more years ago. When cranberry bogs were constructed, the natural stream channel is rerouted and diverted through constructed dikes and embankments and water control structures and reservoirs. And so the natural stream is no longer apparent. You can see in this ditch at the bottom left, these ditches tend to be really just sort of full of black muck, especially on an abandoned bog where the water is not regularly moving around. The bog itself is, the wetland is covered in several feet of sand. Farmers continually put new small layers of sand on the cranberry vines. It helps them grow. But this means that once abandoned, right, a lot of cranberry farms are being abandoned because cranberry farming is no longer as financially viable as it used to be. And if this site is abandoned, that bog will not revert to a wetland. It will revert to some sort of scrub shrub or forest community, upland forest. So we can fix this. It does require going in with some big yellow machines, and it looks very messy and, extensive alterations happening, but this is restoration. It's not alteration like development. It's really very distinct from that. Take out the fill, take out the water control devices, and restore a natural stream channel. And we know that this can work. Here's Mass Audubon's Tidmarsh Wildlife Sanctuary at Plymouth, 1 year after that restoration that you just saw on the previous slide. There was a massive native plant seed bank. We did do some supplemental plantings as well. But I would not call this an impact. I would call this restoration. Now salt marshes, they really need a lot of help too. Salt marshes are among the most highly regulated under our wetland laws in Massachusetts. But they were subject to extensive alterations in history. First for farming, they were farmed for the hay, and there were ditches and embankments and water control structures put in place for that. And then later on, there was grid ditching for mosquito control. And unfortunately, these ditches and embankments have completely altered the natural hydrology of the Salt Marsh Creek system and create either over draining, which then leads to subsidence, which causes the salt marsh to collapse or form these pools on the sort of waffle board on the lower left. And it's really interfering with, salt marshes are already facing sea level rise. They may be able to keep up at least for some period of time if the hydrology can be restored. So here's one of the methods that are being used now to restore these salt marshes, taking hay from the adjacent salt marsh, placing it within a ditch that we want to heal, and then tacking that down with biodegradable stakes and twine. This then allows, as the water flows back and forth across the marsh, sediment is trapped in that hay, and the marsh grasses pretty quickly, within a year or two, begin to grow. And within a number of years, the ditch sort of naturally heals and fills in. And the techniques for this are pretty well developed, and they're done in conjunction with other techniques called runneling, and marsh mounds, which are placed for the nesting of the salt marsh sparrow. So it's really low impact activity that is crucial to restoring these resources. I love this cartoon. This is from the Organization for the Assabet Rivers, Assabet, Sudbury, and Concord Rivers, really illustrating what dams do to our rivers in a way that I think is very accessible. Dam restoration is sometimes, dam removal is sometimes one of the more difficult ones to work with the local community, because people get very attached to the way things are or always have been for their lifetime. And when they see a mill pond, they appreciate it as it is, and not understanding the impacts that it's having to the water, the fish, sediment flows, etc. And then finally, last example I'll show here is culverts. This is an example from Beckett, Mass. On the left, there were some old culverts that's the first replacement that was done but basically with the same kind of culverts that are used everywhere, every road stream crossing. And then Tropical Storm Irene came along and washed out the road. And some temporary culverts were put in on the lower right. That sort of illustrates one of the problems, frequent problems with culverts. Even if they're in good condition, there's often that drop off, that perched kind of condition, and it's very difficult for fish to get up and across, and certainly any other kind of wildlife. They tend to like crawl up onto the road and be subject to roadkill. So on the left is the bridge that was ultimately constructed there. And we need to do a lot more of this. Many cases with culverts, we don't need a full-scale bridge. You can do something like an open bottom box culvert. So there are many co-benefits to restoration, including for climate and climate resilience, as well as biodiversity, and benefits to people, the recreational opportunities that these restored sites offer. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how Massachusetts is incorporating restoration planning into its plans, and also about the large scope of restoration needs. And the numbers I'm going to give for Massachusetts are, roughly comparable to things that are happening in adjoining states like Rhode Island as well. So Massachusetts has been a leader in planning for and addressing climate change. We have a commitment to reach net zero by 2050, and also big goals for adaptation and resilience. We have a statewide resilient mass plan, resilient lands initiative. We also have a biodiversity initiative underway. These plans include many specific actions that address restoration. I think there's more than a dozen of them in the resilient mass plan. And then this is a quote from our Department of Fish and Game's strategic plan, mentioning the importance of streamlining permitting for restoration and accelerating the pace of it. So just, how big is the scope of work that needs to be done? So I mentioned salt marshes earlier, and here again, you can see the grid ditching. We have about 45,000 acres of salt marsh left in Massachusetts. So it's one of the larger amounts of salt marsh in the, in the region, just because of our coastline and the big marshes we have at the Great Marsh and Barnstable, Great Marsh, Nauset Marsh, etc. We lost like 40% of our salt marshes historically, way back when with the early construction, filling around Boston Harbor and other big cities. A lot of that was built on fill. But for what remains, we need to keep these resources and not lose them. So we need to remediate those ditches and the embankments that are associated with them. Dams is a big need here as well. We've got 3,000 dams in Massachusetts. Most of them were built long ago for mills that no longer exist. They're obsolete. A lot of them are in poor condition and present safety hazards. I know that Rhode Island has, I think, 669 dams, kind of a similar situation for the scale of the state. Some of these dams will stay. Certainly, if they're water supply reservoir dams, we're going to keep them. But for the vast majority that no longer serve a useful purpose, we need to remove them. And we are doing that, but at a very slow pace. So last year, Massachusetts removed, it's 3 or 4 dams. With 3,000 of them, it's going to take hundreds of years to get to where we need to be unless we can step up the pace of the work. And then with culverts, the numbers are even bigger because every single road stream or railroad stream crossing has usually a culvert, or if it's larger, maybe a bridge. And there's somewhere between 25 and 30,000 of them in Massachusetts. I think there's somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 in Rhode Island. And a lot of these were constructed again a long time ago. They didn't take into account the kind of intense storms that we have now, so the dangers of washing out the roads, but also the barriers to fish and wildlife movement. And then, of course, the cranberry bogs that I mentioned earlier, lots of those that are being abandoned are in coastal stream watersheds, where there's a real opportunity not only right now to restore freshwater wetland ecosystem, but then by reconnecting those streams to the ocean, those are also high potential for future salt marsh restoration. So just in summary, this is what we're trying to do, but we need to really scale it up. We want to restore the streams and their functioning and their connectivity, as well as the buffers and the shorelines, and reconnecting floodplains, and protecting people from floods, as well as providing all the benefits for nature. So what are the barriers? I worked with the Conservation Law Foundation a couple of years ago and did a survey, variety of people, similar backgrounds to what we have in the audience here today, across multiple sectors. And then CLF did some more in-depth interviews to get more perspectives. And what we found was that the most common barrier to this work was the confusing and difficult permitting. Funding and capacity were also mentioned. The fact is that if we can ease the permitting burdens, then the money for these projects can be spread further instead of spending a couple of years and hundreds of thousands of dollars on permitting. If we can shorten up that time frame and reduce the costs, we can get a lot more of these projects done. And that will also address some of the capacity issues where it's pretty overwhelming, for example, for small municipalities to take these projects on, because it takes a lot to manage them, particularly the permitting. There was this common sense of urgency about the need to do this work, concern about inconsistencies across different agencies and what they were requiring, and a desire for the practitioners to work cooperatively with the agencies to sort this out and to improve the system. I'd like to quote at the bottom, one of the interviewees said that we need a completely new model for how we approach regulatory work and on restoration. And I completely agree. I mean, this is very different than development, which is the way our regulations were originally developed to prevent impacts to wetlands from development. And we need a completely different system to facilitate and speed up and scale up the restoration work. So we need a new approach. And just think about what we have right now. It's really easy to allow all that ongoing damage to occur, the abandoned dams, the abandoned cranberry bogs, the ditches in the salt marsh, etc. It's hard to repair them. So we want to flip that and make it easy to do the repair and restoration work and harder to allow this ongoing damage to continue. So here's sort of an illustrated example. This is how rivers work, how they function, how they make habitat. It's a combination of water flowing, the sediments that move along with that water, forming riffles and pools, and then also wood in our wooded landscape provides important habitat features. So what happens when we have a dam? Here is an old dam in Pelham, and here's the back side of the dam. So we're now looking downstream at the dam. And this is 150 years of sediment and wood trapped behind the dam. And of course, the fish can't use this river, move upstream, etc. But there's nothing saying that this has to be removed, right? There's nothing in the laws that say you have to get rid of this obsolete thing that's just completely ruining the river. Now, the good news is that that particular dam was indeed removed through a partnership of many different organizations and agencies. And when it was removed, as we've seen in so many other dam removal projects, immediately fish, these are sea lampreys, within days returned and were able to travel upstream to spawn. And there's even papers written about this. Alex is the author of this particular paper, along with others. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it so hard to do this kind of work, especially when you think about what is the purpose of these laws. For example, Federal Clean Water Act, it states right up front in its purpose to restore and maintain the nation's waters. So I think pie in the sky, like, what would an ideal system look like? And this, I think, is not attainable in the near future, but just have to think if we could do things really right, what would we do? Maybe we require that dams that no longer have a useful purpose have to be removed. In Spain, they're doing this where if a private landowner has a dam that's no longer in use, the government will actually come in and take it out. Abandoned cranberry bogs, that they should be decommissioned if they're going to be abandoned. I don't know who would pay for that. That's a whole other question. But just leaving them in place is just going to cause ongoing harm. And similarly, we can't just keep our salt marshes in the degraded state that we're in. We have to do the work to restore them. We know how to do it, and it's urgent that we do more of that work soon. So we have to change our whole system and our whole way of thinking about things if we're going to achieve this. So now I'm going to talk just briefly about what is happening on permanent streamlining. I would say that the federal and state agencies do recognize the importance of restoration, and there are some efforts underway to improve permitting. This is kind of the list of the most commonly applicable laws and regulations for a restoration project in Massachusetts. Not all of these apply in all instances, but a restoration project can require up to, say, 12 different permits, and it can take a very long time. It can take easily a year, sometimes up to 5 years, and then beyond that, there's requirements for ongoing monitoring. And this is particularly burdensome for our environmental justice or underserved communities, under-resourced communities, and for nonprofits that are trying to restore their own lands. We have a project where there's like this little culvert on an old cart path leading out into salt marsh. And the staff person from up there was describing to me the other day, like the complexity of just trying to figure out what to do about this small culvert on a woods road. It was very daunting because of the regulations involved. But for urban communities in particular that are already facing, high land costs, there may be contamination issues they have to deal with, removal of things that were built there in the past. So, we need to at least reduce the permitting costs and time to the extent possible. So this illustrates kind of the process of doing a restoration project, starting with getting an idea, selecting a site, scoping it out, doing some feasibility studies and assessments, and then designing and engineering, raising the funds, working with the community around the project. And then you get into permitting and finally construction. And I mentioned about the monitoring and adaptively managing. It is important to do that once a project is done to make sure that it's working as intended. But some of the monitoring requirements have really been extensive and more like scientific research than what's necessary to just make sure the project worked. And that can add on hundreds of thousands of dollars of costs to a project. And, I asked myself, like, what kind of monitoring is required, say, when a development comes in, cuts down all the forest, reshapes the land, builds buildings and parking lots and other impervious surfaces? Yeah, they have to install a stormwater management system, but there's no requirement usually for them to follow up and, look at the health of the adjoining wetland before and after their project, or ongoing monitoring of of water quality, etc. So this is what we call the permitting, the Oreo. You know, the design and implementation of many of these projects can be relatively short, but the permitting on average is taking like 18 months. So what are we doing about this? I'm very grateful that state of Massachusetts, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, the Department of Environmental Protection, and other agencies are engaging in a wetlands and waterways streamlining initiative. And so they have all of the agencies talking amongst themselves, and that includes the ones I just mentioned, plus Department of Fish and Game, the Natural Heritage Program, coastal zone management, etc., all talking together amongst themselves about, hey, how's permitting working and how can we make it more efficient? And then there's also an external stakeholder group of which I participate along with other colleagues from partner organizations. And this has all been facilitated by a consultant facilitator. So we're finishing up year one of this now, and they're going to be continuing for another year, which is great. But I would just note that a couple of things about the structure of this process. First, the agencies meet on their own, and the stakeholder group met separately. Some of the agency people attended some of the stakeholder meetings and listened, but there was no opportunity for these folks to interact with each other and to really do some facilitated problem solving. So what I would very much like for myself and some restoration practitioners from other organizations, from other nonprofits and from consulting firms, be able to sit down with the agencies and really talk this through and identify what the problems are from both of their perspectives and do some active problem solving together. I think that is what we really need to get to the solution. The other thing is that this process is not just for restoration. It includes housing interests and DOT, roads, and other infrastructure. So the way the stakeholder meetings have been run, you know, we've been providing sort of input from all these different perspectives, but there was not a separate focused discussion specifically on restoration and recognizing that restoration is very different than development or infrastructure. So this is a little bit about sort of where this is all headed. They're dividing up proposed changes into 3 different tiers. The first one would be like some things that could be done just like by right or with very little administrative oversight. Things like if a homeowner has a hazardous tree in their yard and it happens to be, you know, in a buffer zone to a wetland, maintenance of vegetation alongside roads or placement of poles or signs, you know, the simple kinds of things like that. Maybe some minor work on invasive plant removals. That would be nice. The second tier would be general permits, where if you meet certain criteria and certain conditions, then you're basically guaranteed to get your permit. And hopefully it would be relatively quick compared to what the process is now. We have a few of these already for ecological restoration projects under the Wetlands Protection Act in Massachusetts, for certain categories of restoration. And they're planning to add a few more. I would just say that while those processes are appreciated, they're still rather cumbersome, and they're not combining the permits for all of the permits required. It's only like specific to the Wetlands Protection Act. So that doesn't get you, you know, it doesn't address other issues. Like we have Chapter 91 is the Waterways Act or Tidelands Act, which is an old law, a very important law that protects the public interest in public access to rivers, shorelines, the tidal zone, and provides access for navigation along waterways. So it's very important to uphold those rights, but you know, requiring a Chapter 91 license for removal of a dam or removal of the fill in a cranberry bog or healing of ditches in the salt marsh, it really doesn't make sense to me because there's no structure remaining in place that needs to be licensed. And those licenses have to be signed by the governor and recorded on the deed and then renewed in 30 years. Now, what does that mean on someone's title, on their property? And what are we licensing? If there's no longer a dam there anymore, it's a natural river. Like, why do you need a license? So I think rather than a general permit, which is what is being proposed in the new environmental bond that was just announced the other day, I think we need just like, these should be exempt from Chapter 91, at least certain categories of restoration. And then the last here is sort of the standard permitting pathway, but more coordination across the programs. They may be doing some investments in IT to do like a combined online application. That's going to take some time. I think it's a good idea for all kinds of permitting, but it's not really going to get to the root of our problem. So take a breath there. In terms of the streamlining initiative, some of other like kind of overall key concerns I have, beyond the fact that we didn't get to talk about just restoration as a separate thing, there was no real discussion of what are the goals and objectives for the streamlining. So if we know what the goal is, all those 3,000 dams, like, are we going to take out half of them over the next 15 years? Or are we going to replace half of the culverts? That's actually in a resilient mass finance investment strategy talks about replacing half of the culverts. How are we going to scale up to get there? And so we need to set the goals and then design a permitting system that will meet those goals. And we didn't do any of that. We just like threw spaghetti at the wall with, what are your ideas for making the permitting system work better? And I think if you don't have a goal and a vision, you can't get to that endpoint, especially if you don't even know what that desired endpoint is. So our recommendation and our still remaining, our hope is that we can convene the agencies in the restoration practitioners to get together to talk and to really problem solve together. Other states are doing this. There's an organization called the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, or EPIC, which has a lot of resources. It'll be in the resource slide that you receive with the PDF. And they've compiled information from across the nation, what different states are doing. For example, California has a program called Cutting the Green Tape. Virginia does a combined electronic filing system. There's lots of good ideas out there, and I think the state is looking at this and trying to see, what they might adopt for the many good ideas that others are working on. And these are some of the models that we hope to be able to discuss further with the agencies in advance. So as I was just describing, like with Chapter 91, we think that there should be some broad exemptions for certain kinds of restoration. They will still be reviewed through other permitting systems like the Wetlands Protection Act, or if it's rare species habitat, through the State Endangered Species Act program with natural heritage. But the Chapter 91 review is really unnecessary and duplicative in our mind for a lot of these projects. Massachusetts also has a program called the Licensed Site Professionals Program for waste site cleanups. And we think that's a great model that could perhaps be implemented here, working to identify consultants who have the expertise to design and oversee these projects. And then DEP would only need to audit a subset annually. They wouldn't have to get involved in depth in every single one, especially the ones that are relatively simple. An example would be a small headwater dam that's in the middle of a conserved land. Either it's owned by a municipal or state agency or by a nonprofit organization, the surrounding land is all undeveloped and in conservation ownership, that there's no history of industrial use, no contamination in the sediments, and no, immediate downstream infrastructure or development to be concerned about when the dam is taken out. Those could be done in a month if we didn't have the permitting hurdles. And then the other thing, so California is doing this, the watershed-based permitting. They looking at a whole watershed or a sub-watershed and identifying all the restoration projects that need to be done in that watershed and prioritizing them and then bundling them together and permitting them all as a package. That could be another approach. And then finally, just putting together in a single application with one agency in charge, and having one agency have a mandate to really move these things along, and work with their fellow agencies in making that happen. So just in sum, I want to reiterate that I think the most immediate things that I'd love to see would be establishing a vision and goals and having this interagency practitioner discussion process so we can really dig into transformative change, not incremental change. So as I mentioned, there are some policy proposals in the bond that we'll be looking at closely, and seeing if they can perhaps be advanced or improved. Mass Audubon and our partners are also supporting a separate bill to tackle a few of the sort of low-hanging fruit, the most important things we've identified, like hand removal of invasive plants within wetlands and the Chapter 91 issue that do need a statutory change in order to make that happen. And then also this would support the kind of an initiative that I was talking about, the cooperative initiative between the agencies and the practitioners. You can find out more on our website and sign up to get updates. So I'm just going to quickly switch to let you see the slide with all the resources you'll be able to click on and check out when you get the PDF. There's a cool new guidebook on river restoration from FERCog, for example. So that's the end of my presentation, and I think we can go into Q&A now.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. We do have some questions already in the chat, and to remind folks that you can ask questions by going to the Q&A box in the Zoom control panel. So to get to the first question, can you speak to the issue of wetlands duplication, which some regulations ask for when wetlands are paved over? Does this in fact occur? Is it possible to create wetlands to compensate for destruction?
So there have been a lot of studies looking at wetland replication sites. There was one in Massachusetts a number of years ago. In general, replication does not work in terms of fully replacing all of the functions of the naturally occurring wetland. And even the best replication projects take many years to fully grow in and to create the organic wetland soils that are so important for the functioning and for carbon sequestration, etc. It may replace certain functions like localized lost flood storage. In general, it would probably be better to put more of the money that's spent on replication into restoration projects, but it's really hard to aggregate that in Massachusetts because fortunately we have very little direct wetland fill actually going on because our laws are so strong. So yeah, in general, replication is not really a great solution and it doesn't replace what's lost.
Our next question is there a design guideline for replacing dams with structures that allow for better flow but keep the aesthetic?
I'm sorry, I have a little trouble hearing you there. Maybe I can see that in the design guidelines for replacing dams with structure. So not really. I mean, if a dam needs to stay in place, for whatever reason, like there are some locations I'm aware of where there's like a whole lot of homeowners have private docks and there's a lot of recreational activity going on the lake, and it's just not going to be politically feasible to remove the lake. And there, you can put in a fish ladder, but fish ladders never function the same as a natural river system. The it's never going to replace a natural flowing water. You're going to have more stagnant water, eutrophication, buildup of sediment behind the dam, all of that. So really, we need to take out most of these dams. That's the bottom line. And oftentimes, I've seen many instances where the neighborhood was opposed before the dam came out, but then afterwards, when they saw the beautiful new floodplain with native plants, and usually trails are provided and it's a park, then we've seen people really turn around and say, you know what, I was against this, but now I think it's the best thing that ever happened. So I think a lot of it's about public education and engagement.
Thanks, Heidi. The next question is lampreys are bad in the Great Lakes. Why are we happy to see them here? They prey on game fish in the Great Lakes and are a big problem.
I think it's like any species. If they're in their native habitat where they're supposed to be, it's one thing. And if they get into areas where they're not supposed to be, they become invasive species that can cause a lot of problems in the ecosystem. In the example I showed, they were native and appropriate for that location.
Our next question is, who and how can I contact someone to assist me to implement these? I feel like my community is bare, so to speak, just being dwindled away by other agendas.
So I would just, I don't know if this person can type in a little bit more. Are you in Massachusetts or another state? If you're in Massachusetts, you could start with your conservation commission, but if they're not interested, maybe you have a local watershed association. The state's municipal vulnerability preparedness program and some other programs through the state provide funding for studies to help communities prioritize things like restoration. For example, the town of Uxbridge got money from the MVP program to assess all of their dams and culverts and prioritize where restoration was most needed. And then the MVP program also has the benefit of bringing together different silos from the town hall and getting everyone working together. So those are some ideas of where to start.
Yeah, and this person mentioned they're from Western Massachusetts.
Yeah.
So,
So, yeah, I'd say MVP program, but still talk with your conservation commission and see if they have any interest in it. Maybe just share some of the information about the resources that are available from some of the links, like the Division of Ecological Restoration.
our next question. There are many mass wildlife WMAs that contain wetlands, especially abandoned bogs in Southeast Massachusetts. How might these bogs be restored if they are under the ownership of the Division of the Commonwealth? Seems like an impossible situation.
Yeah, so the wildlife management areas, I know that Mass Wildlife is very interested in restoration. They're prioritizing all the dams on their property to remove as many of them as they can, starting with the ones that would have the most ecological benefit. Um, I think they're looking at some of their bogs as well. They're aware of this issue and the benefits of restoration. So, I may be able to talk with somebody at DFG and get more information and get back to this person, but I'd encourage them to contact Mass Wildlife and to ask this question of them. There may be plans in the work that we're not aware of, because I know it's on their radar and they care about this. And then the environmental bond would provide funding for agencies like DFG and the Department of Conservation and Recreation to do more restoration work on their properties.
There's a link shared in the Q&A box that goes to it's mass.gov to a dam removal. Um, sounds like a dam removal guidance download. And
Yeah, so
yeah,
it is out of date. They're working on updating it. I didn't include it, not so much because of that, but because it's part of a larger body of resources that are available on the Division of Ecological Restoration's website. And probably through Dam Busters too, I would think. So it's, it's what's available now. There was an effort to write a dam removal sediment management guidance document a number of years ago that Alex worked on when he was at DER, and it was like almost done. DER and DEP worked on it together, and then it just never got approved. So that's something else that I think they're taking another look at now and seeing if they can update that, get it out.
another question in the Q&A box. With dam removal, have you encountered needed to address changes to drinking water wells? I am familiar with some lakes where residents worry when the water gets too high, flood risk, but also worry when the water levels fall because older shallow wells are impacted. Have you wrestled through those issues? Any suggestions to educate and prepare or mitigate impacts?
That is an important issue. And so, some of these dam removal projects are more complicated than others, right? The example I gave of the headwater dam that's, surrounded by conservation land is very different than this kind of a situation where you have homeowners on private wells around the pond. And in those more complex situations, then more detailed analysis is needed. And I would say that in those cases, the permitting needs to be a bit more intense and more careful than it would be for that other headwater example. So we definitely want to make sure that restoration work would not impact people's water supplies. And, if it was only, say, one or two, homes, maybe the part of the project could be to drill deeper wells for those particular homeowners. If it was going to be affecting dozens and dozens of people, it might be a different situation. So every site is different.
And the last thing I'm seeing in the Q&A box is that David with Uxbridge, Massachusetts, he offered to talk to the person from Western Mass. So that's great and nice to know that they have a lot of MVP experience.
Yes, that's Dave Tapscott. He's from Uxbridge, which is the community I mentioned that has done so much planning work on this. There's a lot of information on their website as well. Thank you, Dave.
Great, thanks Heidi. And thanks David. That's all for the Q&A box. Did you have a few more slides, Heidi? Or,
No, that's it.
no, that's it?
Yeah, stop sharing. Yeah, and we did pretty good on time, I think, because we just almost at 1 o'clock.
Yes. Yeah. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for attending the webinar today and want to remind everybody that we'll be sending around a follow-up email with the recording, the PDF of the presentation, which will also have the links to those resources. And Heidi, any final words before we log off today?
I just want to thank everyone for coming and for your interest in this topic. And I hope some of you will sign up for our campaign and work with us to, scale up this work and get it done faster and yet well and carefully.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Heidi.
Thanks.